Okay, so we're going to go through Mao's domestic policy. He's just got into power and he's thinking about the big issues that he needs to overcome in order to sort of consolidate and lock down his regime. Most of the material in this presentation comes from Linda Benson's book called China Since 1949. So we're dealing with a time period that, China's still in flux, recovering from the civil war, and one of the first things that really has to go on is to make sure that all of China is within the control of the CCP. And this isn't going to be as straightforward as it seems at first, even though the success of the Long March, which sort of took the Chinese communists from Jiangxi province, kind of scooted them around Sichuan and then finally ending up in the north, certainly brought them into contact with a lot of people, a lot of peasants, and the PLA began to sort of lay down some of the principles by which it was learning and collected new members as others also kind of died and faded away with the strain of the Long March. But there's still huge areas, particularly the sparsely populated northwest of China. We've got a lot of people of different ethnic groups living. Tibet will remain a problem for a couple of years. And then, of course, you've got Hong Kong and Macau leased to Britain and Portugal, and the problem of Taiwan, of course, because the GMD had fled there in 1949, taking most of China's gold reserves with them. By 1951, they'd pretty much moved into and taken control of Tibet. The northwest region perhaps takes a little bit longer, but by 1953 you can say, with the exception of course of Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau, pretty much all of mainland China is within the purview of the CCP. Mao simply decides to wait about Hong Kong and Macau. The treaties are there. Taiwan, of course, will remain the ongoing challenge for the People's Republic of China. So what first of all has to happen? Clearly, all of those peasants that have been contacted over time, remember in the liberated zones from 1946, 1947 onwards, the CCP have been bringing in land reform in local areas. And the key issue here is that it's not simply a top-down process. Party cadres, party members don't just simply rock up in a village and start working out who should get what. It's not as simple and as straightforward as this. And remember, Mao's kind of revolutionary triumph is the high level of mass engagement that happens as a result of this process. It draws millions of peasants into the land reform movement. Before the land is distributed, cadres have to work hard to organise these speak bitterness meetings. And in the account of Stonewall Village, it takes nearly 15 days for them to persuade one farmer to speak up against the bullying local landlord. And of course, that's just one example. In some villages, it happened much more straightforward. In some villages, it took much longer. Once somebody was prepared to speak up, the landlord would be paraded into the meeting area, and then eventually people would pluck up enough courage to start speaking bitterness, and the accusations would start flying. Those ones that were judged bullies and exploiters were executed. It's very difficult to get figures. Linda Benson reckons between 2 and 3 million landlords are executed during this time period. Most of the time their families survive and will go on to bear the stigma in the future of being the son or daughter of a landlord, and that will cause problems for people as the regime continues. But those who are not considered to have been enemies of the people are denounced, and many of them leave with just enough land to survive. But the key element for us, I think, is this huge mass engagement in the process, and I think that's really the triumph of the Chinese Revolution at this stage in many rural areas, is the high levels of engagement by local people. About half of China's land is redistributed. In the north and across the south of China, the south is far more densely populated, and again, the figures from Linda Benson say that in the south, families got about half an acre, in the north, families got just over 2 acres. But it puts the peasant first, it puts the peasant at the centre of the revolutionary process, and generally, across rural areas, support for the CCP is pretty high during these early years of the regime. As far as women go, another key issue, really, which is funny because it hadn't popped up at all that much before as a kind of revolutionary issue was the role of women. And the Chinese Communist Party was very quick to introduce the marriage law in 1950 to try and redress some of the imbalances in Chinese society. But do remember, what happens legally and what happens in practice are often two different things. So that is worth kind of remembering as you go through this process. Many countries have a very patriarchal dominated society, and there was long-standing inequality in China. Foot binding, which you might also think of when it comes to women, was made illegal in China in 1912 and really had faded from fashion and common practice by the 1920s and 1930s. You can see there that the marriage law produces many benefits for women, and again, like I said earlier, what happens in practice, is going to take time, but the law is now put into place there. There is opposition to the marriage law. Some husbands who had paid for their wives, it was a financial transaction, saw women in their family as an investment, and obviously the children were there as workers. Mothers-in-law who had kind of endured years of obedience to fathers and husbands themselves finally were losing out as they kind of made their way through old age, the top of the power struggle in the family. And divorce rates do go up, which, as we also saw in Soviet Russia, causes problems for housing and accommodation. But the principles are set in place, and in practice things are a little bit different, but the law is there to try and get things going in a more positive direction. All of the posters are taken from ChinesePosters.net, and this one is a propaganda poster from 1952. The Chinese had found what they believed to be evidence of America using germ warfare in North Korea, and really this was the response to the Korean War, was the start of one of the big mass campaigns for China, and also shows the success of the Chinese mass campaigns. Low-cost, simple methods needed to be used. There wasn't much money. There weren't high levels of coverage, but there's simple, straightforward things were done that really do make a significant difference for healthcare in China at this time, and an astonishing increase in life expectancy. So a very successful mass campaign for healthcare, and really done on a very low budget, simple advice, simple guidance, and again motivating and mobilising people at a local level to participate in their own healthcare. So pretty successful stuff there at an early stage for Mao. Reading and writing was a real struggle for the Chinese. The characters are simplified to make it easier to learn. The challenge really is that many of the party cadres, many of the party members themselves were barely literate. Teachers go out, they train young people, they're called the teen teachers, they're mobilised to educate families. It remains a real struggle for China right through until the 70s. The mass campaign posters that you've already seen a couple of, and do have a look at ChinesePosters.net because they've got loads of good ones, use simple slogans and themselves became, sort of literacy education tools in their own right. Linda Benson says in her book that probably the literacy rates in the 1950s were most likely exaggerated, but in general progress is made and things move in the right direction, but it's a slow process after years of illiteracy and years of just not enough teachers to go around. In terms of the ethnic minority groups of China, while they're a small part of the Chinese population, they were dispersed over significant parts of the territory in the south, in the northwest, and in the northeast. The Chinese government, the CCP, sort of identifies 40, there's now up to 55 minority groups, although there might be others that the Chinese government doesn't acknowledge. The goal was to give these groups some autonomy in their traditional homelands. That happens in Xinjiang province in the northwest, and it happens a little bit in Tibet as well. There's no question of secession, like there was in the Soviet Union, and there really is no money to take any local initiatives much further. But there's a very loose principle established there in 1949. In terms of the city life, again, China's limited industrial infrastructure needs to grow in order to bring communism to China. So factory managers are retained. The government encourages business owners and bosses to hand their enterprises over to the government, and many choose to do so. There's also a clean-up campaigns, and China's big kind of cities and the sort of the vice area of the sort of city life, gambling, prostitution, illegal drug use. There's sturdy efforts made to try and clean up the cities. And middle class experts were kept in jobs for the time being. The mass campaigns, as we said earlier, were incredibly successful, and again, simple, clear pictures and text, and really, again, a very big visionary goal that comes across, but it's all about that participation in the activity with the responsibility of you as a family member to get involved in what's going on. There's lots of other mass campaigns to talk about. The 3 and 5 antis are worth knowing. The 4 pests campaign has some serious consequences in terms of the ecosystem, with particularly with the sparrow population. But Mao, excuse me, also has some issues, and you can have a look in the book Lynch, page 24, to have a think about how he looks at his potential rivals in the 1950s. Really, he deals with them very quickly, and really Mao sort of moves himself into a kind of place where he's almost sort of so precious and untouchable in the party. It's actually difficult to get in touch with him in that sense of sort of political engagement and to have a dispute. So grade 11, there's some ideas for you about Mao's domestic policy and the impact of those early reforms. So remember what he's trying to do: consolidate power, remove opposition, deliver on some promises, and to try and keep some people happy in order to maintain his rule. Thanks for listening.